Season of the Wish brought changes to both Strand and Solar Titan, and because Restoration got nerfed, Strand Titan is stronger than ever. See, what they did was increase the number of enemies that you need to defeat in order to move up to the next stack of Banner of War. While this alone would have been a decent nerf, they also increased the amount of time that you get by defeating an enemy while you have Banner up. And this is actually pretty massive. So there were times I would go into a boss fight with only a few seconds left on Banner, meaning I'm going to shortly lose out on my healing and my extra damage. Now, it seems like once you get to Banner times 4, it's almost impossible to lose it. This paired with the massive buff that came with Wormgod Caress means that Strand Titan is more potent than it's ever been. I put out a video last week on a super strong Solar Titan build that excels in most content, so if you're interested in that build, link in the description. Even though both of these builds are melee based builds and do good healing and massive damage, there is one key difference: boss DPS. While the Solar build excels in mid to long range since you do have a healing grenade and increased weapon damage from Wormgod, Strand excels at doing the most damage in a single melee. Not to mention that you get 3 melees, and you can pair it with a grapple melee to get a 4th. Many people have been taking versions of this build into dungeons, solo, and one-phasing bosses. It's that strong. Remember to leave a like if you found this video helpful, and if you like seeing build videos and other Destiny 2 helpful content, consider hitting that subscribe button. With that being said, let's jump right on into the build. So let's talk a little bit about the build and how it works. For this build, we're going with the Strand subclass. It's going to output some of the highest DPS and the most amount of damage from all of our abilities. This build can be run a few different ways, but most importantly, you want a 1-2 punch shotgun to power up all of your melees. The first style is going to be the grapple melee spam. You will need the Navigator Exotic Trace Rifle that comes from Ghost of the Deep dungeon, so if you don't have that, then you can use the second way. With this exotic and its catalyst, you can create a grapple point, and once you have that grapple point set, you have access to infinite grapple melees. To set it up, you work your way up to Wormgod Caress times 4, set the grapple point by the boss, get one last melee kill to get that times 5 on your Wormgod and refresh its timer, then pull out your 1-2 punch shotgun, shoot, grapple, melee, and repeat this process. You can use your regular melees first since they do a bit more damage than grapple melees, so use those up and then rinse and repeat until the boss is no more. The second way to do this build is for those who don't have the Navigator. Since you can't create a grapple point, you won't be able to have infinite boss DPS. However, you still can do massive amounts of damage. For this build, you want to use the tractor cannon paired with a 1-2 punch shotgun and a primary weapon. You do the same as before. Work up your Wormgod stacks, pull out your tractor to weaken, and then you're going to pull out your 1-2 punch shotgun. You can actually shoot once and melee twice since the 1-2 punch will actually still be active. So then you shoot one more time to use your final melee, and then shoot again and use your grapple. Once that's done, you pull your tractor cannon back out to refresh that weaken and debuff, and then you pop your super and go to town. This ends up being slightly less damage than the Navigator, but it's still immensely powerful. The reason why this build is so strong is because of all the damage stacking we can do to make our melee super strong. We then use our melee to wipe out basically anything in sight. With a bit of testing, I found that the base powered melee does 27,423 damage, and the grapple melee does 20,828. Now that doesn't seem like much, but once we start amping it up, we can get 20% from the artifact, 40% from Banner of War, 275% from Wormgod, another 150% with a 1-2 punch against a boss, and then 30% from Tractor. With all that added up, we end up at 429,000 damage with our grapple, and a whopping 565,000 with our Frenzy Blade. Now, for comparison, I shot a single rocket from the Apex Predator to get the base damage of almost 106,000 damage. Adding up all of our buffs of 20% from the artifact, 35% from bait and switch, 25% if we can get Radiant, and even 30% from Tractor, which isn't even possible, we would still only end up at 280,000 per rocket, which is barely half of one melee. So let's break down our super and abilities to help you put together the best possible version of this build. First up for our super, we're taking Blade Fury. This is our only option, but when paired with a tractor, it can still do pretty good damage. It's a fantastic go-to option if you don't have the Navigator and you run out of all your melees. Remember, you can use your heavy and then 3 lights and then use your heavy again and repeat that cycle. Some people like to just spam their light attack as much as possible, but that's not really for me. Moving on to our abilities, in most content I am choosing Rally Barricade since Strand not only gets you healing but also damage resistance, so I rarely need the extra cover. With that being said, if you are running harder content, consider using Towering Barricade for that little bit of extra cover. We're also taking Frenzy Blade. Again, it's our only option, but it is super strong. As we said before, this can do over 500,000 in the right scenario. So if you save all three, going into a boss phase, you can do 1.5 million damage with just your melees. This can also be used as a way to create tangles by killing enemies when you're in regular play. And we are going to pair this with the Grapple Grenade. This is the crux of the build when you're pairing it with the Navigator, which is going to give you unlimited access to immensely powerful melees. Moving on to our aspects. First up, Banner of War. This is a no-brainer since we not only get healing that increases with the more stacks of banner that we have, but we also get a 40% increase to our melee and our super. It's another reason why we can do so much damage. And we're also pairing this with Into the Fray. Since this is a melee focused build, this is also a no-brainer. And that's because our melee regeneration is increased by 400% while we have Woven Mail. And we can also get Woven Mail whenever we stand near a tangle that we destroy, which is going to give us more damage resistance and, like I said, more melee regeneration. Alright, moving on to the Fragments. First up, Thread of Warding. This makes it so that when you pick up an orb, you're granted Woven Mail. Not only does this mean we have extra damage resistance more often, but we'll also have increased melee regeneration more often. I'm also pairing this with Thread of Fury. This makes it so that when you damage a target with a tangle, it grants anywhere from 10% to 30% melee energy, depending on the target that you hit. As you can see, we're trying to gain as much melee energy back as we can. Since we do have 3, we do want to continuously be gaining melee energy overall. And then I'm also pairing this with Thread of Finality. This makes it so that when you finish a target, it creates a threadling. I mainly take this for the extra 10 to recovery, and since Wormgod also progresses with finishers. If you don't like doing finishers, this can be replaced with Thread of Propagation, so that whenever you do a powered melee and get a kill, you're granted Unraveling rounds. Use whichever one fits your playstyle. And finally, we're taking Thread of Generation, so that you're granted grenade energy every time you deal damage. This will help you consistently gain back your grapple, which is super useful in general play, especially if you don't have the Navigator. Alright, let's talk about ways to improve the build. First up, our armor mods. For our stats, we want to be shooting for 100 resilience. This is going to keep us a little bit healthier, and with the added 45% that comes from Woven Mail, it's going to make it very hard to kill you. Not only that, but we are on a Titan, so this is going to reduce our barricade cooldown. I also like to take 100 recovery. Granted, this build already has good healing. This is a build that I like to take in solo scenarios, and in those scenarios, having 100 recovery means that doing it solo flawlessly becomes that much easier. Once you get past that 70 mark with recovery, every 10 is going to immensely help with how quickly you gain your health back. After that, I usually shoot for 80 to 100 discipline. Grapple already has a super short cooldown, so 80 to 90 still feels super quick. So you don't necessarily need 100, but if you can get 100, awesome, go for it. And finally, for your strength, I usually do 20 or 50. Now I know that seems like a weird gap, but going from 20 to 30 only gives 4 seconds. Going then to 40 is a fairly decent leap, but I think 50 is kind of a sweet spot. So if you can get 50, I would go for 50 strength, since this will give your cooldown a decent amount without having to take away from too many other stats. But if you can't get to 50, then just go with 20. We do have a decent way to get back melee energy, so you don't really need that much. Alright, moving on to the armor mods. First up, for our helmet, I'm going to be taking hands-on to gain bonus super energy whenever we get melee kills. Again, this is a melee-based build, so it's just going to give us more super energy overall. This is super helpful if you're going in between damage phases and you don't have the Navigator. This could be the difference between you getting your super for your next damage phase or not having it. And then I also like to pair this with Heavy Ammo Finder. You could instead switch this out for Special Ammo Finder if you are running double special like the Navigator and a 1-2 punch shotgun, or if you are running out of shotgun ammo a lot, then I would definitely switch this out for a Special Ammo Finder instead. Otherwise, we're not using our heavy a ton, so it's not super important. And you can also pair this with Harmonic Siphon, so that rapid strand weapon kills create orbs. Again, this isn't really necessary since you're using your abilities a ton, but if you have the space, might as well take it for the extra orbs. Alright, moving on to the arms. First up, we're taking Heavy-Handed, which makes it so that with every powered melee, you're going to create an orb. This does have a 10-second cooldown in between making orbs. Orbs are not only going to give us Woven Mail, but also increase our melee regeneration rate, so we do want to create orbs as much as possible. And then we're also going to pair this with Impact Induction, so that causing damage with our powered melee is going to give us grenade energy. This does have a 7-second cooldown, but it is nice to have that little bit of extra grenade energy to get our grapple back even quicker. And finally, we're taking Grenade Kickstart. Kickstart mods did get a small buff this season on how much energy they provide on the lower end, but this mod will mainly help if you run out of powered melees. If you have the Navigator, it's not necessary, and you could take a Dexterity or a Reloader mod instead. Alright, moving on to the chest. I do like to take 3 resistance mods, and mainly depending on the content. Usually I like to take 2 of the 3, either Arc, Void, or Solar, since most enemies are going to be dealing one of those types of damage, and match that to the enemies that you are facing. And for the last one, we like to take a melee resistance. Since this is a melee build, you will be up close and personal with a ton of enemies, so having that extra 15% damage resistance is key. Alright, moving on to the legs. First up, I'm taking Recuperation. We do have pretty good healing, but sometimes you just need that little bit of extra boost whenever you pick up those orbs. And we are going to be creating a ton of orbs, so might as well get a little bit extra health in the process. Speaking of which, we're also going to pair this with Invigoration to gain an extra 10% melee energy whenever we do pick up an orb. And finally, we're pairing this with Elemental Charge. Since we are using a kickstart mod, it's super important to have as much armor charge as possible for every time we use our grapple. This will make it so that on every other tangle pickup, we gain 1 armor charge. We should be able to make a ton of tangles, and we want to be throwing them at enemies anyway to gain more melee energy. So why not also gain more armor charge in the process? Fun tip, you can also grapple onto the tangle that you're throwing to gain an extra grapple in the process. And finally, for our mark, I'm going to take Outreach, so that when we use our class ability, we're going to gain melee energy back. Since we can hold 3 melee abilities, we won't always have 3 up, so this will help us overall just gaining a little bit more melee energy. And then we're also going to pair this with Reaper, so that after we use our barricade, our next weapon kill is going to grant an orb. As we mentioned before, orbs give us a ton of ability energy and woven mail, so this gives us a more consistent way to generate more orbs. And then finally, we're pairing that with Powerful Attraction, so that it makes it a little bit easier to pick up those orbs whenever we use our barricade. Alright, let's talk about the artifact. Since this is an ability build, there are a few that you can use to power up your build a little bit more, but most aren't as relevant. So the important ones are From Whence You Came, Wished Into Being, Solo Operative when solo, and then when using a strand weapon, Unraveling Orbs, and Horde Shuttle. From Whence You Came gives you a flat 5% damage buff to scorn and taken enemies, and there are a decent amount of those this season. Wished Into Being will give you 3 orbs on any ability kill while your super is almost fully charged. And since we will be using our powered melee a ton, this will happen decently often. And then Solo Operative is going to give you a flat 15% damage increase while you're solo. This is a no-brainer when you're going for solo runs. If you are using a strand weapon, then Unraveling Orbs will give your strand weapons unraveling rounds when you pick up an orb. And then you pair that with Horde Shuttle, which will cause a threadling to spawn when you deal enough weapon damage to an unraveled target. This just equates to a little bit more damage, but it's also not really necessary. If you're using a solar primary, Kindling Trigger, Flint Strike, and Torch can all be helpful, but also aren't really necessary. Alright, let's talk about weapons. Normally, I break this down by weapon slot, but since this build is so ability focused, there are only 3 important weapons. First, if you have the Navigator, it's the best option for sustained DPS and can even help clear out rooms of enemies. Because you can create that grapple point, every time you grapple to it, you're immediately refunded your grapple back. So just being able to create that grapple point is immensely helpful. And second, if you don't have the Navigator, Tractor is your next best option, since it will give you a flat 30% damage increase that is stackable with all other damage increases. You can pull out Tractor to use on bosses or any other mini boss that is going to give you a little bit of trouble. And finally, a 1-2 punch shotgun. Swordbreaker from Crota's End is a great strand option, and the Aikilos is a great option for solar. But in reality, any shotgun that has 1-2 punch will do the job. This will give you a 100% increase on your next melee when you land every pellet, but when you are doing this on a boss, this increase is bumped up to 150%. This is what really pushes this build over the edge. Since both your powered melee and your grapple melee count, you're going to be dealing massive amounts of damage every time you shotgun and then melee. You can use any primary you want, since this will be mainly focused on using your melee and your grapple as much as possible. As I mentioned in the solar build video, Wormgod is the new king of melee-based builds. Because of all the buffs we can take advantage of, we deal a maximum of 2,000% more damage with our melees, making it capable of easily one-shotting most enemies and dealing massive boss DPS. Not only is our melee super powerful, but we have 3 plus a grapple that when paired with the Navigator gives you unlimited access to one of the highest damage abilities in the game. We have access to fantastic healing from Banner of War and extra damage resistance from Woven Mail as the cherry on top to survive basically anything. This build is being used by many speedrunners to set unprecedented times in solo flawless clears. Go check out Zemo, where he takes a similar version of this build into the new dungeon and clears it in less than 11 minutes. Let me know your thoughts of the build. What would you change or how would you improve it? If you like the video and want to see more content like this, smash that like button and subscribe. That's it for me. Peace out.